Next, we have Candice. Candice Jackson is an attorney in a solo practice mainly in California, Oregon, and Washington. Her practice is dedicated to defense of sex-based rights and civil liberties, including legal actions for detransitioners, preservation of women's single-sex spaces and sports, and First Amendment rights to challenge the trend of replacing objective sex categories with subjective gender identity notions. From 2017 to 2020, Candice served as head of the Office for Civil Rights and as Deputy General Counsel in the U.S. Department of Education. This is where she spearheaded the first ever regulations under Title IX governing how schools and colleges handle sexual harassment and assault. Candice spent 21 years with her late wife, Patty, raising their twins, Madeline and Zachary, and lives in Washington State. Thank you, Candice.
Thank you. So all evening, we've been discussing the gender industry, the harms to young people caused by the lie that sex is somehow self-determined, self-chosen, the institutional endorsement of that lie that results in parents feeling powerless to help their kids, or even attacked as abusive by government agencies and schools and institutions, the way the medical industry has converted and perverted the very concept of healthcare into mere application of medical technology according to individual desire or whim. So let's step back now and scrutinize the concept of so-called gender identity. Always picture that in quotation marks. It's not a real thing. How it has sprung up and become ensconced in laws and official policies that very much dictate how we all have to interact with this novel concept. And then I'll also talk a little bit about the kinds of lawsuits and legal actions that are out there starting to challenge and push back on the notion of gender identity in law. I want to put out a hypothesis. This is why I think gender identity as a concept has found such wide appeal and why it has found safe quarter in our official laws and policies over the last decade or so. And to a large degree, if this hypothesis is accurate, it explains both the seduction of otherwise intelligent people to buy into such an ephemeral and unprovable set of concepts, and to some degree points the way on how to get the gender genie back in the bottle, at least in the legal realm. The nutshell of it is gender ideology is a potent slate of religious faith-based doctrines. And this is not a slight or a smack against religion of any kind. But step back and think about what we're told. If you can make your way through the contradictions and the paradoxes of how anything related to gender identity is ever described by those who profess it and subscribe to it, think about what we're told. It's presented as emanating out of science. It's presented as emanating out of civil rights. But what it comes down to is a set of core beliefs that you really must take on faith, because there's no way to measure this. There's no way to measure for it. There's no way to test for it. There's no way to identify it. There is no objective definition. There's no coherent description of even what we're talking about when we talk about gender identity or a person's internal sense of what their gender is. So if you think of gender identity as a collection of tenets or doctrines that require some leap of faith to buy into, then it helps explain why people across the board in law and medicine, in education, have been so quick, I think, to subscribe to it. Because here's what it allows people to do. It allows people to gain the psychic benefits of religious fervor and metaphysical, philosophical, religious-based meaning and purpose in life, but they don't have to admit that that's what they're doing. That's the key, because they get to hide behind, well, it's science, pseudoscience, it's civil rights, co-opted civil rights. But that's what they get to do. They get to say, we're just on the train of progress. We're just continuing and taking the next step forward into the realm of completely secular. We're going to follow the science and we're going to pursue equality for all people. Science and civil rights. That's the secular cover that gender identity theory gets to hide behind. But what it's really doing is giving people in all walks of life, in all kinds of different positions of authority, the reward of feeling like they are pursuing a greater good. And if you listen to the dialogue that comes from the pro-affirmation side, you can spot the savior complexes and the passionate, blind belief that it doesn't matter what harms we point out because it's all for a greater good. How religious does that sound? Or could, it is very, very faith-based in that sense. So that's how a theory like gender identity, I think, made its way into laws and gave us things like, out in California, men can transfer into women's prison at their own choosing, not even by being diagnosed with gender dysphoria, not by having completed any kind of surgery that would make them think they're trying to fit in anatomically. None of that. Simply and solely by self-identification as being non-binary or transgender. And there's no definitions of those terms given, except the circular, it's back to, it's what somebody believes about themselves. So why is it that gender identity has become fixed in laws, but in the category of non-discrimination for the most part, which is kind of where it started? So we have certain characteristics that over time we've decided in law that we're going to require non-discrimination based on. We've done that with race, with disability, with sex, and that's where we started to shove gender identity, as though it is a characteristic that disadvantages someone, and so the law needs to step in and promise non-discrimination despite having that characteristic. On the other side of the law is a much more subjective category where we find practice and belief of religion. And the law has traditionally done a pretty good job at drawing a line between saying, we're not going to make you prove your religion. You have every right to believe or not believe in any manner you choose. And the only lines we're going to draw and the only prohibitions we're going to put on you is if practicing that belief crosses over into violating laws and rules that have general applicability and are out there for everyone's safety. So that might be an outer limit on practicing a religious belief. And we're going to draw a bright line and say that governments and institutions are not going to officially endorse. They're not going to endorse anyone's particular religion. That allows for pluralism. I'll bet just in this room, much less the wider audience watching, I'll bet there is just a long list of different kinds of personal and spiritual and religious beliefs and practices that each of us have or reject or have an opinion about or so forth. And it's that balance that allows that kind of plurality. It's one of the secrets of success of why we have come so far in the Enlightenment model and been able to create societies that say we are going to provide rational, logical, secular justifications for the general laws that we're going to hold each other to. Within that, we're going to allow a plurality, a prevalence of different kinds of viewpoints and beliefs. So in my view, the honing in on the biggest problem with law and gender identity as a concept is that it got misclassified. Somehow along the way, we let it slide in there right alongside race, religion, race, sex, disability. Now gender identity is on that list. Now, of course, because the very notion of gender identity, whatever it is, has something to do with sex, it ends up literally eviscerating sex as a legal concept, because you cannot have both in the law. You cannot have the objective concept of sex, categorize people based male, female, objectively, and also step back and say, but we're also going to honor and validate everyone's personal gender identity, which can change their sex apparently and determine their sex. If we could put gender identity, though, on the other side where religious beliefs are protected and handled, it makes a lot more sense, because at that point, it's really just a subset of beliefs that people are absolutely entitled to hold. But there's a line there where there would never be any rational justification for lawmakers to cross the line and say, oh, well, not only do you have the right to go out and proclaim that you are male when you're not, you have the right to proclaim that, you have the right to believe it, but you never would have the right to compel others to validate that belief, and you never would have the right to exempt yourself from generally applicable neutral rules like sex classifications that make sense. Girls sports team, boys sports team. Register, your report data, crime statistics. We're going to mark down whether this is happening to or with a male or a female. Those are just facts, and we're going to report those despite anybody's religious belief, and therefore despite anybody's personal belief about their own or anybody else's sex that conflicts with basic reality. So that to me is kind of the basis of the confusion, the legal confusion, where the legal mess around gender identity emanates from. And now I'll just talk for a couple of minutes about some of the types of legal actions that are growing out there to push back on this. There are here and there popping up single-sex space challenges. We've seen actions come up in prison contexts. Those are getting a lot more popular, and sports contexts. And even if you're not close to the issues of sports or women in prison, pay attention to those lawsuits and protests and so forth as they go forward, because in my view, the side that promotes gender identity and gender affirmation, they have to win everything all the time. Because if we win in one space, the illogic, the irrationality, the internal contradictions of what they're putting out there and trying to make us all adhere to, it gets revealed, and it all starts to fall apart. Because what are you going to say? This athlete gets to choose to call himself a woman and play women's basketball, but then if he gets arrested, he doesn't get to go to women's prison. I mean, it starts to not work for them if we can win in just one area. They have to keep up this pretense in every area all the time. So when we see detransitioners banding together to help each other find the courage to go into court and challenge the diagnosis that they were given that led them down a path of gender affirmation, to use the tools of medical malpractice and medical negligence and maybe even fraud. We're starting to talk about that out there and say, hey, this is more than just negligence going on. This is a complete failure of any kind of truly informed consent. Probably could cross over into medical battery and outright intentional fraud. So we're starting to see that come up, and the community of detransitioners who are helping each other find the wherewithal and the courage to, if it's right for them, go through those courtroom doors and push those theories. That's attacking things on the medical side. And the single space side, you know, we're seeing schools get attacked more and more as parents start to realize that not only are their own kids being socially or in some cases even medically transitioned without parental input, but even the kids who aren't putting their hand up for any kind of transition, they're still being affected, right? Their free speech is being affected. Their ability to be safe and safeguarded in adult-child situations like overnight accommodations on school field trips is being affected. Their ability to feel safe playing sports or any kind of activity where they're going to have to go in and change in a locker room or a bathroom. So all kids are being affected by this. And so we're starting to see an uptick of legal actions by parents against schools as well. So I think it's a positive trend that we're seeing, and I would just encourage everybody to not shy away from pointing out the illogic and this has been sold to a large extent as something so highbrow and so academic and so theoretical and so brilliant that none of us can possibly understand it. Call that out. We know common sense when we see it. What is new is rarely true. What is true is rarely new. The old insights that we've all grown up with and honed over the course of decades of real life experience and perception hold true. And we don't have to be in fear that, oh, well, the experts must know something we don't know. Because I think as everybody's been revealing tonight, it is the experts themselves who have led the charge in letting us down and letting our kids down. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Candice.